Hi everyone, it's John Mitchell, and in today's video, we are going to delve into the world of restraining forces. Now, as we know from our work in Lewin's force field analysis, restraining forces are those that are working against a change within a business. So they look to keep the business in its current state, making any successful implementation of a change a really challenging task. Now, while there are 11 driving forces in our study design that you needed to know, fortunately, there are only 6 restraining forces that are listed that we need to know, and we're going to go through today. And like the driving forces, businesses could be faced with restraining forces other than those listed in this video and in the study design. And how we're going to look at this is like we did with the driving forces, we're going to look at examples of how each of them can work against change, but that is not necessarily an exhaustive list. So our first restraining force is with the managers. So managers may oppose change due to fears of the impact that it can have on them personally. Now, often changes require managers to learn new strategies, take risks, guide employees through the challenges of the transition. And so that resistance is particularly common amongst middle and lower management that are often dealing with that day to day. And they're often responsible for carrying out and overseeing those changes. Now, also, in the event of restructuring, it's those levels, those middle and lower level management levels that bear the brunt of the restructure, sometimes even becoming redundant, and therefore they can be very resistant to those kind of changes. And resistance from managers can also stem from a lack of necessary skills to effectively lead change. Because remember, change can be a really difficult process to go through in a business because it can impact so many people. And to be effective, the managers need to have some key skills like leadership, communication, empathy, and managers that lack those skills to lead the business through the change can act as a restraining force and work against that successful implementation of the change. Next, we have employees, and they are directly impacted by the change because they're required to adapt to the new processes. And so, change can often trigger fear and anxiety amongst employees because there's uncertainties, and that those uncertainties could be around their role and what it will look like once the change is implemented, the colleagues that they may be working with, or even their job security. And so, the disruption of their comfort zone and the alterations to the status quo make it quite confronting for many employees, which can cause a large amount of resistance. And particularly if the employees get together in groups and create a real groundswell against the change. So it becomes really crucial for managers to work to overcome that resistance. And we're going to look at ways that managers can do that when we get into outcome two. Time can also be a restraining force, so change can be a really complex and time consuming process, and businesses may not always have the luxury of having enough time to execute those changes the way they want to. So, timing of the changes can also be a factor. So, the economic conditions or the financial position of a business could make certain periods less ideal to actually implementing a change. And so, if we look at the example of the retailer David Jones back in 2020, well, they intended to close several stores and focus more on their online sales, but financial pressures and time constraints forced them to take another route, and they sold their business rather than implementing their intended changes. Next, we have this concept of organizational inertia. So, organizational inertia is the unenthusiastic response of the people in the business, particularly management, to the proposed change. And so, it typically occurs in businesses that have a deeply embedded culture or long standing employees who are very set in their ways. And that makes it very difficult for the business to implement change because it's challenging to gain momentum, and any actions to implement change often fizzles out and the business remains in its current state because the employees are simply happy and the managers are simply happy with the way things are. And so, for a change to be implemented successfully in those types of situations, it often requires a significant disruptor to overcome that inertia and really push the business towards a new state. Legislation, which we previously discussed as a driving force, can also act as a restraining force. So, whether it's existing laws that are in place or laws that change over time, that legislation can potentially increase the expenses associated with implementing a change, or it can actually make it difficult to implement change because the laws are preventing a change from actually occurring. So, a couple of examples to make this to illustrate this point. Back in 2021, Coles was facing zoning regulations that prevented them from opening a new supermarket in a Melbourne neighbourhood. So, despite their efforts to getting the zoning rechanged, they weren't able to do so, and that therefore it prevented that from actually occurring. And another case involved McDonald's, which wanted to make changes to its employee rostering system, but the Fair Work Commission ruled that it would actually breach the Fair Work Act. So the legislation that was in place prevented those changes from occurring and increased the associated costs of trying to implement that particular change. And so with legislation, any changes that a business is looking to implement, they can work against the change by either preventing it completely or actually increasing the cost and time that it takes to implement the change. And lastly, we have financial considerations. So, implementing change can be a really expensive exercise. It involves costs around resource allocation, implementing new technologies, changing the physical layout of the facility, maybe employee training, and possibly bringing in change experts. And so, businesses, regardless of their size, have limited financial resources. So, they need to consider the costs of implementing the change within the business. And it's important for senior managers to conduct a cost benefit analysis to ensure that any proposed changes are financially viable. It's also important for managers to carefully consider their funding options and the potential financial impacts of the proposed change. For example, they may use their own funds or they could take on debt, and each option has its own advantages and disadvantages depending on the financial situation of the business, and it may be a restraining force that needs to be overcome. But the expense of implementing changes can be significant and therefore can work against the implementation of a proposed change. So, just to recap, restraining forces are those that working against a particular change. There are 6 restraining forces listed in our study design. It's not an exhaustive list, so when you're studying businesses, you may come across other restraining forces, and that's okay to use them as well. And keep in mind that the way we looked at these restraining forces today was just examples of how they can work against particular change, not necessarily the only way that they can work against a proposed change, because it can alter depending on what the change is. So that brings us to the end of this video. Can't wait to see you in the next video, where we're going to finish off this outcome and look at Porter's generic strategies and how to gain a competitive advantage. But until then, just remember that for questions, activities, and help in your VCE journey, then come on over to teachingbubble.com.